One afternoon, I ran into him. I had thought the encounter would be easier, but when I saw him, standing across the street, something inside me tightened. He hadn't changed. He looked the same, as if time had stood still for him. The look in his eyes, though, was different. There was no anger, no resentment, just a quiet emptiness, a void, almost as if he too had been living in silence. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at each other. I couldn't read him. I wanted to say something, anything, but I couldn't find the words. I had so much to say to him, questions, regrets, things that had been left unsaid. But in that moment, I realized I'd already said everything I needed to say. He had already made his decision, and so had I. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. His words seemed genuine, but there was a coldness to them. It wasn't an invitation to talk. It was just a statement of fact, a recognition of the space between us. "I didn't think I would want to," I replied, my voice steady but my heart racing. The words surprised me as soon as they left my mouth. I had thought I was still hurt, still yearning for his presence, but in that moment, I realized I had moved on. I had let go. He wasn't the person I had once loved anymore. He was just someone from my past. There was a pause, a long silence that hung between us, before he took a step forward. "I'm sorry for what I said," he finally muttered. "I didn't mean it. I was just, I don't know." I felt a brief flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe relief, but it was quickly gone. His apology didn't matter anymore. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, to take back the hurtful words, the broken trust. I realized that the apology wasn't for me. It was for him, a way for him to ease the guilt, to make himself feel better. But I didn't need it. I didn't need him to fix it. "I know," I said quietly, "and I don't need you to apologize anymore." My voice was firm, but there was no bitterness in it. I had made peace with everything that had happened, and that was all I needed. He looked at me, searching my face for something, perhaps an opening, a chance for reconciliation. But I didn't give it to him. The silence between us was no longer uncomfortable. It was a silence of two people who had accepted the reality of their situation. We were no longer a part of each other's lives, and we didn't need to be. "Well," he said, breaking the silence with a small, almost wistful smile, "I guess this is it then." I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Yeah, I guess so." And with that, I turned and walked away, my heart light, my step steady. I didn't look back. The days that followed that encounter were strange. There was no anger, no sadness, just a strange sense of peace. I had expected to feel something more, perhaps regret, perhaps longing, but I didn't. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, one I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I felt free, for the first time in a long time. The silence between us, the one I had feared so much, had become a comfort. I no longer needed answers from him. I no longer needed his validation. I had started to rebuild my life, piece by piece, and I was doing just fine on my own. I had rediscovered parts of myself that I had long forgotten. My hobbies, my passions, the things that made me happy before him. I had become so wrapped up in our relationship that I had lost sight of who I was outside of it. But now, without him, I was beginning to see myself again. It was a slow process, but it felt like I was coming back to life. I spent my evenings doing things I'd always loved but had neglected. I painted again, something I hadn't done in years. I read books without interruptions. I even started taking long walks in the park, just to clear my mind and enjoy the solitude. I realized how much I had missed the simplicity of being alone, of not having to compromise or explain myself. It was during one of those walks that I ran into an old friend. She was someone I hadn't seen in years, but someone I had always considered close. She was surprised to see me walking alone, and we quickly fell into conversation, catching up on everything that had happened in our lives since we had last spoken. "You look different," she said after a few minutes, eyeing me carefully. "You look happier." I smiled, surprised by the observation. "I guess I am," I replied honestly. "It's been a rough few months, but I'm finally starting to feel like myself again." She smiled back, her eyes warm. "I'm glad to hear that. You deserve to be happy." The conversation drifted to lighter topics, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe without the weight of the past looming over me. I realized that the life I was building, the one without him, was mine to shape. I didn't need to hold on to the past any longer. It wasn't easy to let go of everything, to release the person I had once cared for so deeply. But as the days passed, I saw more and more how much I had changed, how much stronger I had become. I wasn't the same person who had been crushed by his words. I was someone new, someone who had found her way back to herself. A few weeks had passed since that encounter. The silence that once terrified me had now become my sanctuary. I felt stronger than ever, and as time went on, I began to realize just how much I had grown. The decision to walk away from everything had been one of the hardest I had ever made, but it had led me to a life I could finally say was my own. I had started going to therapy. At first, I wasn't sure it would help, but as I sat there, sharing my thoughts with someone who didn't judge or make me feel small, I began to understand myself in ways I hadn't before. Therapy wasn't about finding closure or answers. It was about learning how to heal. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was doing just that. I was no longer waiting for him to come back or for an apology that would never come. Instead, I was focusing on myself. I was making new friends, reconnecting with old ones, and rediscovering the things that made me feel alive. I had started taking yoga classes, something I'd always wanted to do, but never had the time for. I felt my body growing stronger, my mind becoming clearer. It was in one of these yoga classes that I met someone new, someone who had become an important part of my life. Her name was Sarah, and she had an energy about her that was contagious. We bonded instantly, talking about everything and nothing. It was refreshing to connect with someone who understood what it meant to start over, to rebuild from the ground up. She had her own story of heartbreak and loss, but she didn't let it define her. Like me, she was learning to find peace in the silence. As the weeks passed, I noticed the way people started to treat me differently. There was a new sense of respect, not just from others, but from myself as well. I wasn't walking around with my heart exposed anymore, waiting for someone to hurt me. I had closed that chapter and was opening a new one where I was in control of my own happiness. There were still moments of doubt, of course. There were days when I missed the familiar comfort of his presence, the idea of us together. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. I no longer needed him to complete me. I had learned to be whole on my own. I had learned that the most important relationship I would ever have was the one with myself. And now, I was living my life for me, not for anyone else. The future was no longer something I feared. It was something I looked forward to. It was a quiet afternoon when he looked at me, his face a mixture of anger and disappointment. The words he spoke seemed to cut deeper than anything I had ever heard before. I never want to see your face again. He stood there, staring at me with cold eyes, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. I stayed silent, feeling the weight of those words sink into my chest. I wanted to shout back, to tell him how wrong he was, but I didn't. I just stood there, paralyzed by the finality of what he had just said. There was a part of me that wanted to run after him, to beg for forgiveness, but another part of me, the stronger part, knew that I couldn't. This wasn't the first time he had pushed me away, but this was different. This was the moment I realized it wasn't just a fight, it was the end. I had been waiting for this moment, the moment when he would finally see me for who I truly was. But instead, I got this. A cold, hard dismissal. The silence between us grew, and all I could do was think about the years of love and pain that had led to this point. How had it all come to this? How had we gone from love to this finality? I stayed silent, but inside my mind raced. As he turned and walked out the door, I stood frozen. His words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of what had just happened. I never wanted to see your face again. I never wanted to be the one to say those words, but now that he had said them, I wondered if they were true. Was he right? Was I really the one to blame? The days that followed were a blur of emotions, anger, confusion, and a deep, aching sadness. I couldn't understand how we had arrived at this point. He had been my everything once. We had shared laughter, joy, and dreams of the future. Now, all I had was an empty room and the haunting memory of his words. I never want to see your face again. I replayed that moment over and over, trying to find some reason, some explanation for his outburst. But no matter how much I searched, all I found was a sense of guilt. What had I done wrong? Was I too much? Had I been selfish? The questions seemed endless, and yet no answers came. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that I was sorry, that I never meant to hurt him, but I knew deep down that no words would change what had been said. I spent days alone, trapped in my thoughts, trying to piece together what had happened. I had always known our relationship wasn't perfect, but I never imagined it would end like this. I had given so much of myself to him, so much of my heart, and yet it didn't seem to matter. His words, those simple, devastating words, had torn down everything we had built together. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that perhaps, in some way, I had been expecting this. Maybe I had been waiting for him to pull away, to push me away. I had always feared that one day this would be the result of all the unresolved tension between us. Perhaps, subconsciously, I had prepared myself for the inevitable, but even knowing that didn't make the pain any easier to bear. I looked around my apartment, at the space we had shared, and everything felt so hollow. His absence was like a heavy weight on my chest. The pictures on the walls, the things we had built together, felt like reminders of something that no longer existed. I tried to tell myself that it was over, that I should move on, but the truth was, I didn't know how to let go. The phone remained silent. No calls, no texts, just the deafening silence of him keeping his word. And all I could do was wait for something to change, for him to come back, or for me to find the strength to walk away from the memory of him. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between us became more unbearable with each passing day. The world outside kept moving, but inside, everything felt frozen. I would pass by his favorite spots, the places we used to go together, and a wave of nostalgia would wash over me. But then, the reality would hit, the truth that he was no longer part of my life. I tried to distract myself with work, with friends, with the little things that used to bring me joy. But nothing seemed to fill the emptiness that had settled deep inside me. I felt lost, like a part of me was missing. I had been so consumed by the idea of us for so long that now, without him, I didn't know who I was anymore. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was doing the same, wondering if he ever regretted his words, or if he was simply at peace without me in his life. The thought of him moving on so easily, of him living a life without me, was almost unbearable. I wanted to reach out, to beg him to reconsider, but I knew it would be futile. His words had been clear. He never wanted to see my face again. I began to wonder if this was my fault, if I had pushed him too far, if I had done something unforgivable. We had always had our issues, but we had worked through them before, hadn't we? Why was this different? Why couldn't we overcome whatever was pulling us apart now? Then one day, as I was going through the motions of my daily routine, I realized something. I had been waiting for him to come back, to apologize, to fix things. But why? Why was I waiting for someone who had made it clear they didn't want me? Why was I giving so much of myself to someone who had already walked away? It was then that I realized I had to start living for myself. I had spent so much time trying to make him happy, trying to keep the peace, trying to be someone I thought he wanted me to be. But now, I had to be myself again. I had to find my voice, my purpose, and my strength. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I had to begin the healing process. I started to reconnect with the parts of myself that I had neglected. I reconnected with old friends, took up hobbies I had once loved, and focused on rebuilding my life. Slowly but surely, I began to rediscover who I was outside of the relationship. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was a start. The silence remained, but I started to fill it with something else, something more fulfilling. And in time, I realized that I didn't need his validation, his approval, or his presence to be whole. I was enough on my own. It had been a few months since that painful day, and life had started to settle into a strange rhythm. I had gotten used to the silence, learned how to live without him in it. My heart still carried the weight of what had been, but it wasn't as heavy as before. It was like an old scar, still there, but no longer bleeding. The days continued to pass, and with each one, I felt more like myself. The healing was slow but steady, and I had come to accept that it was a process, not a race. I wasn't in any hurry to move on or get over anything. The truth was, I didn't need to. I was learning to live in the present, to appreciate the small moments that came my way. I had learned to take joy in things I once took for granted. A walk in the park, a quiet evening with a book, or a coffee shared with a friend. Sarah and I had become close, and our friendship had brought a kind of peace I hadn't known I needed. We would meet often, talking about our lives, sharing our stories. She had been through her own share of struggles, and yet she was one of the most positive, strong people I knew. She didn't let the past dictate her future. Instead, she chose to build something new. One evening, as we sat at a cafe, I realized how much I had changed. I was no longer that person who clung to the past, hoping for things to go back to the way they were. I had stopped waiting for a phone call or a message from him. The thought didn't even cross my mind anymore. The longing I once had was replaced by something far more valuable: freedom. It wasn't just freedom from him, but freedom from the fear that had held me captive for so long. I was free to choose my path, free to make decisions without worrying about what anyone else thought. I didn't have to ask for permission to live my life anymore. I was in control, and that was the most empowering feeling I had ever experienced. I had also started to think about the future, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. I was excited about it. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew I was on the right path. There were opportunities one hadn't even considered before, new things I wanted to try. I was learning to trust myself again, to believe that I had the strength to face whatever came my way. But most importantly, I was learning to embrace the idea of being alone, not as something to fear, but as something to cherish. I didn't need anyone else to complete me. I was whole on my own. I had built this new version of myself piece by piece, and I was proud of what I had accomplished. It was a quiet evening when I realized that I had finally found peace. I was no longer seeking validation from others. I wasn't waiting for approval or an apology. I had let go of all that. What mattered now was the person I was becoming, the person I had always been deep down, buried under the pain and fear. And for the first time in a long while, I could say with certainty that I was happy, not because of anything or anyone else, but because I had chosen to be.